My name is Barb Sackel. Today's video is made possible by QuiltWoman.com. The video that follows is the split rail fence. Now you've noticed that I have provided a pattern to go along with my beginner quilting series. This is the pattern. It's 4 blocks. Here's the split rail fence. We're going to learn strip piecing today. Next time will be the churn dash, followed by the flower pot, and finally the courthouse steps. And then we'll finally put it all together with a sashing, a little bit of quilting. So let's go on to today's split rail fence. One thing that I always tell my students is when you learn something, you need to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, and this makes you build your confidence but also your quilting skills. I have put together another pattern. This is called Pop Flannel, and this will increase your skills working with the split rail fence, or better known as strip piecing. Well, what you're going to do is open up your pattern to the first page, and you'll see the instructions start here with the split rail fence. First thing I tell all my students is once your pieces are cut, and I had pre-cut the pieces needed, you're going to take them and set them up in your space. Let's go set up our pieces. Now that we have our strips cut, and remember we learned about cutting in the rotary cutting and measuring tips and tricks video, I always recommend to lay out all your pieces next to you so that you can just pick as you need them. I have my instructions here, and I have my strips set here, and now I'm ready to sew. I'm going to pick up my first 2 strips. It's going to be the white one, and my instructions say the yellow one. I do try to put plenty of pictures in my patterns, and that'll help you along your quilting journey. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to align the top 2 pieces of my colors, and I'm going to insert it into the sewing machine. Now remember, on the 1/4 inch seam allowance video, we talked about how to get the perfect 1/4 inch. So because I sew on the Juki, I have the perfect 1/4 inch scant foot. If you don't have a Juki, then you should have a piece of masking tape lined up so that you will be sewing a scant 1/4 inch. Now that we have our 2 pieces put under the presser foot of the machine, I notice how I put my finger in between the 2 strips, and my hand hangs down in front of me. This is how I hold my strips while feeding them. So this hand, my left hand, is up top guiding, and my right hand is down holding the fabric. This way it doesn't get caught on anything and I can get a smooth feed. Now I'm going to start sewing, keeping my foot right on the edge here, and you can see I'm going to start making adjustments with both hands while I sew, and I sew about 4 or 5 inches, and then I readjust to make sure I'm right on the edge of both. Make adjustments. Again, adjusting all the way down. And of course these strips are right sides together. Unless otherwise told, they'll always be right sides together. And finally, now that I'm at the end, I'm going to place it and just feed it through. And there I have my first strip piece. Now let's go to the ironing board. Now here we are at our ironing board. You can do 2 things at this point. Some people like to leave their piece down like this and press the seam allowance closed because it acts like Velcro and it will actually grab onto each other and make pressing a little bit easier. I'll leave that up to you whether you do or you don't do that. Now what I do is I take the top strip and I fold it open. I'm going to introduce the tip of my iron on there, and I'm going to push it over. Now notice my hand here. I have my fingers underneath this. My first finger is on this side, and my thumb, while I'm pulling away, is actually going to be finger pressing this open. So I'm finger pressing with my thumb with my left hand while my right hand introduces the iron into the place. This way you're going to have a seam allowance that's open entirely. The last thing you want, especially for strip piecing, is having a seam allowance that doesn't iron open all the way. Then you lose your size of your finished product. So again, I'm going to introduce the iron, and as I drag my thumb across, I'm actually pushing down onto the ironing board, almost pressing this as I go along. Now because I applied that tension, you'll notice how this is absolutely straight. If I had tried to iron in motions like this, the strip would wave with every attempt that you iron. So again, I'm going to pull this towards me, put my thumb in place right on the seam, and again I'm pushing into the ironing board, giving it a little bit of a tautness as I go along. And this is not only ironed nice and open, but it's ironed straight. Let's go on to our next strip. Okay, now that we have our strips nicely pressed, we're going to use our third strip, and that is the green strip will be attached to the yellow. But remember when I told you to start your two strips perfectly aligned? Well, as we keep adding strips on and on and on, the fabric will tend to bend, and you'll get this long piece of fabric that bends in a C motion. We want to prevent that from happening, and here's a couple ideas that will help. First of all, we're going to start at the opposite end. Now when you turn that over, you might want to put your green against the white, but you have to put your green against the yellow. So what that means is not only are we going to line that up perfectly so we know where the next strip goes, but we have to turn this upside down so that your bigger unit is actually on top. This is going to feel a little awkward at first. Okay, insert your fabric, and I'm ready to go. Here at the ironing board, and what you want to do is put your green up and just iron that open like we did the first one. However, here's where it starts to get a little tricky. Looking at the back side, you'll see that I ironed towards the white. Now the general rule of ironing is always to iron to the dark, unless otherwise told. On this particular strip piece, I want to iron all in one direction, so I started ironing to the light. I'm not too concerned about this particular piece, but in general you always want to iron to the dark. Now if I open up my green, you'll see that it actually presses towards the green. Well, because I want them all in one direction, I have to start at the other end. Put the green down and open up the bigger unit. So then that way they'll both be in the same direction. So here I'm going to start by introducing the tip of my iron. I'm going to take my hand and put my thumb in its place, and here I go. And I'm just going to iron down. And now I'm going to come back and just smooth that out, and you can see I have still kept a very straight line. Let's finish that off. In the center of the fabric where the fold is, you'll notice that little fold area doesn't always iron out. If I can help it, I won't use those pieces when I do my cutting. There we go. Let's add our last piece. Again, remember to start at the opposite end. Here we are back at the ironing board with our last piece added. Once again, I'd like all these running in the same direction, so I just put it in place, give a peek under there to make sure it is running in the same direction. And now you'll notice that I have to grab a lot, but my thumb is still pressing before my iron. And I'm going to come back and pay special attention to that center area where the fabric was folded. It gets a little trickier when you have a handful of fabric, but you still want to keep that thumb doing its job to get that nice straight press. Now we go to the cutting board. Okay, here is our strip piece laid out on our mat. I am not using the mat grid at all, so it doesn't matter how you lay it out there. Just lay it out nice and flat. You can go to a square ruler now. I'm using the 9.5 inches square, but you can use a 6.5 inch square too. Or if you have just the two rulers, I recommended you be using your 12.5 inch square at this point. Now in the instructions it says cut out 4 pieces. Sometimes I call them chunks. But the 4 pieces that you need are going to be 6.5 inches wide by 6.5 inches long. Remember how we made our first cut in the cutting video, in that you had to do an oversized cut? Well, we're going to do the same thing here. I cannot make my first cut here because I have nothing under here to measure by. So I'm going to take my 6.5 inch on the ruler and I'm going to extend it to make sure that all these tails are cut off. So I'm going to bring it about 7.5 inches in. Then I'm going to pick a line, and you can pick either the white seam, the yellow seam, the green, doesn't matter which one, but you're going to pick it and you're going to line it up perfect all the way down. And here I've done 3.25 inches. Now this is where it's really important, because remember we talked about the C? This is going to help compensate for that and give you a straight block. So you're going to measure 2 things. You're always going to measure a line underneath your block, and then you're going to measure that your piece is centered from top to bottom. So here I've measured that. That's nice and aligned. I'm going to make my cut, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to turn that piece around, put it on my 6.5 inches over here, and because I already aligned that, I'm not too worried about that right now. And I'm going to make my second cut. Here is our first piece ready to go. Every time you cut off a chunk, now you can see that there is a little bit of a curve happening here. Most likely you'll have to do a new cut every single time. I might try to measure off of this, but if I did and I measured my 3.25 here, and remember this is just an arbitrary number, this edge might line up to the 6.5 and it might not. If it doesn't line up to the 6.5, you need to do a new overcut. So I'm going to check it. It is lining up, and it's lining up here. Therefore, I know my strip is still straight at this point. I can cut out my second piece. Now here's where I tried to avoid that middle section that kept the fold. The question is, can I get another piece before that middle section? Yes, I can. But here's where the C is starting to happen. And I'm going to take a still picture so that you can see this. I lined up right here. Let's go 3.25. Now down here in the bottom it's at 6.5, but up here it's almost 1/4 inch off. That is the C. That's the C of the fabric happening. So we need to do an overcut. We're going to cut a little bit bigger here. All right. And turn it around. Now I know I'm going to line up perfectly on both directions. And you can see how much that you little bit at the end going wider. So with each strip cut, you can't just go down cutting, 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 cutting. Each time you have to measure and see if you need a new edge. Now I want to stay away from this piece that actually shows the iron marks. So I'm going to go to my other end and make my 4th and final cut. I'm going to go in a bit. There's my 3.25 lining up against the yellow. Make my cut, turn this piece around and measure out exactly 6.5 inches and cut off the ends. And now I have my 4 pieces ready to go. Well, here we are at the sewing machine. We're ready to put our block together. And as you've noticed, I generally do a layout in my pattern, and you want to follow that layout and put your block exactly how it needs to be sewn next to you. So what I'm going to do is sew always across in rows. And I do that just as a general rule across all my quilting. So I'm going to take the top row and put those two pieces together. There's nothing to line up here, so I'm just going to line up the edge. And I'm going to sew the pieces together. At this point, you can do what we call chain piecing. That means you don't cut this piece off yet. You pick up your next piece to sew, and you continue sewing. And in this fashion, it saves you a lot of time, especially if you have 10 or 12 or 20 pieces. You just continue to chain piece as you progress. So I don't cut that thread coming through. And now I'll take my scissors, my scissors, and cut that apart, and we'll take this over to the ironing board. So now we have our blocks sewn in as many pieces together as we can, and I try to do as much of my block at once so that when I come over it helps with the ironing process, meaning you have to press the seams in opposite directions whenever you have a seam allowance that matches up. So here I'm going to press it to the white again because I have no seam allowances over here and it's just going to be a flat press. So I'm just simply going to press it, and then I know I need this one pressed towards the white, and I'm going to press it like that. And this is just a simple press, and then we're ready to join these two units. Now we come back to our machine. Again, lay out your block. Every single time before you sew, go ahead and lay out your block. Now I'm going to join the rows. So I'm going to fold this row over on top. And this is going to take one pin at the seam allowance right here. Now remember how I had you press these in opposite directions? Press this top that way, press the bottom that way. Well, I'm going to take these two pieces that are pressed, and they look like arrows to me, and I'm going to kiss them. And when those two seams get nestled right up next to each other and they're doing a little kiss there, I'm going to take one pin and I'm going to put it in place. You're going to always pin your seams. Make them have a nice kiss, and later on it'll look pretty nice when you open it up. Then I'm going to match the top of the two pieces to sew. I'm going to sew up to the pin, release it, and continue the rest of the way. Once in a while your seams will sew over, as that one did. It's going to happen all the time. Don't worry about it. We do the best we can do. Now let's take a look. There we go. Perfect seam. We take this to the ironing board, we finish pressing, and we're done. Okay, now we've finished our piece. This is our finished product. So part one of our beginning quilt is done. Now if you decide to practice and do the pop flannel, you'll be working with strip sets of 3. Remember how we talked about cutting them out? That's the whole trick to this quilt. Well, thank you for joining me today, and you can find these quilt patterns and quilt kits at QuiltWoman.com.